1. Introduction. RAWSEP View. The United States government was on track in the Biden administration to reduce the prices for both clean energy heat pumps and clean energy electric cars. Trump tariffs are expected to upset those plans to prevent future air pollution and prevent climate change. The United States government should, instead of certifying wood stoves as safe when they are not safe, go forward with regulations that ban wood stove use and direct government money for use of forest refuse only. For home building and furniture building, for just a few examples of use of forest products for non-burning uses, it is well known from scientific and medical research that wood burning is a substantial source of PM 2.5 emissions, yet the wood burning industry uses the scientifically debunked theory named carbon neutrality of wood burning to argue that wood burning replacing coal burning in industry and in a trickle-down argument that wood burning should continue for home heating should continue. Presumably because it is called renewable, wood may be renewable in the sense that a tree can be planted in the place of a cut-down burned tree, but it takes centuries or decades for the newly planted tree to attain the stature of the cut-down burned tree. During those centuries or decades, photosynthesis, which converts CO2 to oxygen and so sequesters some carbon, will not take place at the same rate as photosynthesis was performed previously, and wood burning emits both CO2 and PM 2.5, and PM 2.5 is not absorbed by trees, so PM 2.5 is not diminished by planting a tree in the place of a cut-down and burned tree. In fact, a living tree closes its pores against the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning, just as humans hold their breath in the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning. And when a tree closes its pores, the level of photosynthesis that absorbs CO2 pollution goes down. Wood burning emits 90% PM 2.5 particulate matter of 2.5 micrometer size, the perfect size to infiltrate the human lungs, setting off a cascade of human health problems and early deaths. Contrary to many beliefs, wood burning emits 2.8 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel coal burning, and wood burning emits 450 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel natural gas burning. Replacing coal burning with wood burning creates more air pollution in the form of CO2 and PM 2.5 than coal burning. This emission data comes from testing the cleanest burning wood stove in the United Kingdom, the Eco-Design Wood Stove, and International Convention does not count the emissions from wood burning. The emissions from wood burning are erased from all countries around the world when calculating if each country has met its climate goals. This non-counting or erasure of wood burning emissions data from climate goals does not mean wood burning emissions do not exist. RAWSEP View. Purple air PM 2.5 monitors hanging from the eaves of the house of a near neighbor should be used to measure the level of PM 2.5 in the air hyperlocally in the yards of near neighbors of indoor residential wood burners. If PM 2.5 levels exceed World Health Organization standards of 5 micrograms per cubic meter annually, then that evidence of air pollution from wood burning should lead to the shutdown of that indoor residential wood burning appliance, one appliance at a time if necessary.
Hi, my name is Lily. Andrew gave you the intro to Residents Against Wood Smoke Emission Particulates and their concern for air pollution from indoor residential wood burning. Residents Against Wood Smoke Emission Particulates, or RAWSEP, would like every near neighbor of an indoor residential wood burner whose wood smoke enters their yards and sickens the near neighbors to have a purple air PM 2.5 monitor hanging from the eaves of their home to measure the level of PM 2.5 entering their yards. That measurement of air pollution should be used as evidence of unnecessary air pollution, and each indoor residential wood burner should be shut down based on that evidence, one indoor residential wood burner at a time if necessary. The presentation by Andrew ended at 2 minutes 5 seconds. The same presentation by Emma starts at 2 minutes 3 seconds before the end of this podcast. So I am Lily, your timekeeper, and you can start the next podcast at 2 minutes 5 seconds in if you would not like to see the presentation by Andrew a second time. This presentation by me, Lily, ends at 5 minutes in. What you will see in the main content of this RAWSEP podcast will be news about air pollution from indoor residential wood burning and how that air pollution is being combated by ordinary people just like you who are unfortunately near neighbors of indoor residential wood burners at this time. There will also be news about unnecessary and highly polluting use of wood as fuel in industrial wood burners and preventable air pollution from wood burning wildfires. There will also be news about air pollution from PM 2.5 from gas-powered cars. There will also be news about airborne diseases which are also preventable with vaccines such as COVID-19 and measles and whooping cough, to name just a few. In 2025, Residents Against Wood Smoke Emission Particulates is also concerned with combating the Trump destruction of government funding for programs which protect human health through the Department of Health and Human Services, and Trump destruction of programs which fund the science and medical research plan to protect human health from preventable illnesses. Protecting human health is a patriotic act, and our defense against enemies is weakened if we are not as healthy as we can be. Heat pump rebates are now offered by the federal government, distributed through the eligible United States, are available in 2025, and are the best, cleanest, and now cheapest alternative to indoor residential wood burning if that burning is actually done to purportedly save money. Wind and solar as sources of the electricity that powers heat pumps and electric cars is also cheaper than burning wood. The adverse health effects that are caused by indoor residential wood burning also come at a cost to near neighbors, both in shortening and ending their lives, and in actual hospital, clinic, and funeral costs. Instead of being compensated monetarily, near neighbors should instead be able to achieve immediate relief by stopping indoor residential wood burning in their hyper-localized neighborhoods, which relief readings from purple air PM 2.5 monitors used as evidence of air pollution will help them achieve. Welcome to news about hopeful scientific and medical achievements that will also help us achieve the goal of clean air to breathe.
Webisode 57DHXYO, October 20th, 2025, Mississippi Biomass firm granted permit for more emissions. In Webisode 57DHXYO, one Mississippi resident sue UK-owned biomass firm granted permit for more emissions. 2 Trump pollution. The kids who sued Trump just lost big in court, or did they? 3 coal miners, their family members, and union representatives rallied outside of the U.S. Department of Labor for States Jostle Over $50 billion rural health fund as the Trump Medicaid cuts trigger Scramble. 5 headlines. Main content. 0 RAWSEP View It is known that wood burning emissions cause adverse health effects and early deaths to near neighbors. In this case, the permit for a Mississippi biomass wood pellet plant has sparked protests from near neighbors who enumerate adverse health effects from the air pollution of the plant. The adverse health effects directly from the burning of the wood occur in the United Kingdom, where the wood pellets from the Mississippi plant are shipped. Mississippi, near neighbors too. The wood pellet plant are suing. A second point is that coal mining workers are suing Trump because of adverse health effects of working with coal, which is a solid fuel like wood fuel, with both creating PM 2.5 emissions injurious to human health, although the dirty renewable wood burning emits 2.8 times the PM 2.5 and CO2 as the fossil fuel coal burning. The health effects on near neighbors of burning wood are even more devastating than those from burning coal. For that reason, a third point in this episode is that rural voters should take note that a rural health fund has been cut by Trump. One Mississippi resident sue UK-owned biomass firm granted permit for more emissions. Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization, The Guardian, October 18, 2025. Nearby residents say they have had health concerns due to air pollution from Drax Biomass facility. Residents of a small Mississippi town are suing Drax Biomass after the company won a permit to become a major source of hazardous air pollution at a local wood pellet production plant. The subsidiary of the FTSE 250 energy company was previously denied permission to increase emissions in the 900-person town of Gloucester, Mississippi, after local residents warned that they had already suffered serious adverse health consequences because of the operation. But in a reversal of the April decision, the Mississippi Department of Environmental Quality MDQ Permit Board on Wednesday granted the Drax Amite County wood pellet production facility a permit. The plant in Gloucester converts trees sourced from southern U.S. states into wooden pellets, which are burned as biomass fuel in the Drax huge power station in Selby, North Yorkshire, England. Drax is expected to receive more than £10 billion in UK renewable energy subsidies between 2012 and 2027 for its biomass generation, according to the think tank Ember, despite criticism from green groups and climate scientists which claim that the wood it uses to manufacture biomass pellets is not sustainably sourced. The company was found to have supplied inaccurate data relating to its sourcing of biomass, leading to a £25 million $33 million fine, which was paid to the UK energy regulator. The company is currently being investigated by the UK Financial Conduct Authority (FCA), and lawmakers in the UK have been reviewing the billions in renewables subsidies. The North Yorkshire plant receives the new lawsuit against Drax. Alleges that the Amite County facility, which shares a fence line with the larger community, has unlawfully exposed locals to excessive levels of chemicals and pollutants. It says those in turn have coated the homes of people and put them at greater risk of diseases such as cancer and respiratory illness. Residents of the Gloucester, predominantly black low-income town, have reported feeling dizzy, getting headaches, and otherwise feeling unwell since the facility opened a decade ago, and they have expressed concern that any plans for increased emissions could worsen respiratory illnesses, heart disease, and other health issues linked to the pollutants. The approval came despite the previous standards violations of the site, which resulted in a $250,000 fine last year for releasing over 50% more harmful pollutants than allowed, and a $2.5 million penalty in 2020. In a recent letter to the Mississippi governor and the MDQ Permit Board, 85 advocacy organizations expressed concern at the effect the Drax manufacturing has had on the Gloucester residents and urged steps to ensure they can breathe clean, safe air, from young children with asthma who are unable to play outside to elderly residents reliant on costly breathing treatments. It is clear that Gloucester is a community in crisis. The organizations wrote those who can afford to leave are doing so, they added, while those who remain are left to suffer worsening health. 2 Montana, Missoula, and Livingston Trump pollution. The kids who sued Trump just lost big in court, or did they? Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization, The New York Times, October 18, 2025. A federal judge threw out their climate lawsuit against the president a few days ago, but legal experts say there was a silver lining in the opinion of the judge when a judge threw out a lawsuit this week accusing President Trump of violating the Constitution. It was a major setback for a group of young people trying to fight climate change in the courts, but the ruling had a silver lining. The judge also said the plaintiffs had successfully argued that climate change constitutes a health emergency for children. Legal experts said that language reinforced a years-long strategy by an organization called the Trust of Our Children, a public interest law firm, to put children and young people in the courtroom and on the stand to argue that governments should do more to rein in global warming. The opinion of the judge offered very detailed guidance for designing cases that can overcome the challenges this one faced. The judge dismissed the case, citing the legal precedent that a similar case had been thrown out earlier. The court went out of its way, he said, to establish that the plaintiffs in the case Lighthizer versus Trump had successfully tied health risks for children to the Trump climate policies. It did not have to, but by doing so, the ruling, even though it is a clear loss for the plaintiffs, will shape how other courts weigh similar arguments in the future. The strategy of filing climate lawsuits with children and young people as plaintiffs has become a fixture of the legal landscape worldwide in recent years. It can win sympathy and public attention for a case, but it has its risks too. For the plaintiffs, there is the risk of putting children or young people on the stand and exposing them not only to cross-examination but also potential public criticism or attacks more broadly. As for the defense, young plaintiffs can raise difficult questions about when or how aggressively to go about cross-examining people who might be as young as elementary school age. For example, in the Montana case thrown out this week, the Justice Department declined to cross-examine 2 of the underage plaintiffs ages 17 and 11 during a 2-day hearing last month. That hearing in the federal court in Missoula had Moments of drama in the case filed in May. A group of 22 young people led by the Trust of Our Children sued the federal government, arguing that 3 of the Trump executive orders promoting fossil fuels would intensify climate change, threatening the health of young people and violating the guarantees of life and liberty. In the Constitution, government lawyers countered that the lawsuit was meritless and should be dismissed. A 17-year-old young woman of Livingston, Montana, was one of the plaintiffs who took the stand, testifying about the difficulties of caring for her horses during wildfires. Later, listening to a defense argument that involved making a point about laws against speeding, she scribbled a note to her lawyer: "People get a choice on how fast they go on the highway." She wrote, "We cannot choose how much coal is driven through my town." Later, her lawyer Julia Olson read the note in court, saying, "The plaintiffs always make me cry, Your Honor, but the case could not overcome what the defendants, the president, and a dozen federal agencies said was its fatal flaw." They argued that it was a facsimile of a case filed a decade ago by the Trust of Our Children. Juliana versus United States. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, the same court that would hear an appeal in this case, previously had dismissed Juliana, finding that the political branches of government, not the courts, were the appropriate venue for the plaintiff's demands. Judge Christensen essentially concluded that his hands were bound by the precedent set by that earlier decision. Olson has vowed to appeal the decision of the judge. Despite the recent setback, the Trust of Our Children has had some high-profile successes with the strategy of putting young people at the center of climate lawsuits. The group won a closely watched case in Montana State Court in 2023 and came to a settlement last year in a lawsuit against the Hawaii Department of Transportation. An emeritus professor at the Vermont Law and Graduate School was also unsurprised by the decision in the Lighthizer case, given the precedent, but he called the 31-page opinion of the judge groundbreaking and said it would help build a body of law on climate change and its effects on children. No other U.S. court decision has gone this far, he said. He also pointed to similar cases in Colombia and Germany, as well as a recent International Court of Justice advisory opinion on the legal obligations of states with regard to climate change, which was spurred by a years-long campaign led by students from Pacific Island countries. That ruling of the court, while lacking an enforcement mechanism, said that governments must protect people from the urgent and existential threat of climate change. The Juliana case has no path forward in U.S. courts since the Supreme Court declined to hear an appeal. However, the Trust of Our Children is now bringing it to an international body, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which is part of the Washington-based Organization of American States. In a petition filed last month, the group argued that the United States had violated international law by blocking access to justice for the young plaintiffs. It was exceedingly rare to have testimony about climate change in a U.S. federal court. In her closing argument at the recent hearing in Montana, Olson invoked another case in which children were plaintiffs: Brown v. Board of Education, the 1954 Supreme Court case that declared segregation in schools unconstitutional. The Trust of Our Children might have more success in electoral politics than in courts of law. Climate change is ultimately a political issue, he said. It may be that these kids could have more of an influence on parents and grandparents in the voting booth than they are in the courtroom. A photograph of a bag of colored markers and a hand-drawn poster that reads in part, "Livable Future." Free coal miners, their family members, and union representatives rallied outside of the U.S. Department of Labor. Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. Inside Climate News Weekly, October 18, 2025. Coal miners, their family members, and union representatives urged Trump to enforce a rule that was meant to protect miners from serious health complications, but has been on hold for months. A federal district court in Montana Wednesday granted the Trump request to toss out a youth-led lawsuit challenging Trump efforts to increase the extraction and use of fossil fuels and other actions that suppress climate science and undermine renewable energy. Trump is cutting billions in clean energy investments, but the savings are overstated as prices for wind and solar drop. Favoring fossil fuels means the U.S. is putting all of our money on a horse that is already lost. As one clean energy advocate put it, federal actions make the New York energy future more uncertain amid cuts to federal clean energy grants and pressure from activists to meet New York climate targets. Governor Kathy Hochul faces tough choices and lofty expectations. Rising electric rates tied to distribution spending disasters and some clean energy program study, says a new report from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab identified broad trends in electric rates from 2019 to 2024, but cautioned that it could not prove causality and pricing dynamics vary state to state. The Environmental Protection Agency EPA comeback is a sham fueled by the Trump authoritarian power grab. Critics charge the agency replaced civil servants with Trump loyalists and has failed to correct scientific integrity violations and a flawed cancer risk assessment of a popular pesticide during the Trump first-term watchdog. Groups say as EPA stalls, states are left to handle solar panel waste. A federal plan to manage the coming solar waste tsunami of retired panels has missed its start date, leaving states and the solar industry to patch together their own rules for retiring the panels. 15 states have no rules at all. 4 states jostle over $50 billion rural health fund as the Trump Medicaid cuts trigger. Scramble. Excerpts edited by RAWSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. KFF Health Newsletter, October 17, 2025. In this edition, KFF Health News original story: States jostle over $50 billion rural health fund as the Trump Medicaid cuts trigger. Scramble. Pharmaceuticals. Trump touts pledge to sell IVF drugs at 70% discount on his branded site. Spending and fiscal battles. USDA Secretary warns funds for food stamps will run out in 2 weeks. National Institute of Health IH workers detail grim reality of crippled agency in constant chaos. Health industry with possible sale of 2 Pennsylvania hospitals. The Prospect Company troubled tale may soon end. State watch. Cook County, Illinois sees highest decline in fatal ODs among largest counties. Lifestyle and health. Pickleball related eye injuries surge. Weekend reading. Longer looks, interesting reads you might have missed. Editorials and opinions. Viewpoints. Autism spectrum needs subtypes. From KFF Health News. KFF Health News original story: States jostle over $50 billion rural health fund as the Trump Medicaid cuts trigger. Scramble. States are battling for their piece of $50 billion in federal rural health funding, but it is not just hospitals vying for the money. Tech startups and policy demands are raising the stakes as Medicaid cuts loom. Sarah Jane Tribble, October 17, 2025. Here is the health policy haiku for today. IT Is not that simple one click to heal all websites whisper Liberty Health waits, still unpaid anonymous. If you have a health policy haiku to share, please contact us and let us know if we can include your name. Haikus follow the format of 5, then 7, then 5 syllables. We give extra brownie points if you link back to an original story. Opinions expressed in haikus and cartoons are solely the opinion of the author and do not reflect the opinions of KFF Health News or KFF Summaries of the News. Pharmaceuticals Trump touts pledge to sell IVF drugs at 70% discount on his branded site. In exchange, drug maker EMD Serrano would get a reprieve from certain tariffs if it also invests in research and manufacturing in the U.S. The government also might consider a speedier FDA review for another fertility medicine the company wants to bring to the U.S. market. The Wall Street Journal Trump cost of Ozempic could be $150 drive Oz not. Yet President Trump said in the Oval Office on Thursday that the cost of Ozempic or the fat loss drug could be $150 or much lower than the current cost. Dr. Mehmet Oz, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services administrator, jumped in to say the cost of those drugs had not yet been negotiated. Trump is negotiating the price of drugs with several pharmaceutical companies and has already struck deals with Pfizer and AstraZeneca. Andrews, October 16, 2025. Associated Press, AP. California to sell affordable insulin under state labels starting January 1, 2026. Governor Gavin Newsom said Thursday that California will begin selling affordable insulin under its own label on January 1, 2026, nearly 3 years after he first announced a partnership to sell state-branded generic drugs at lower prices. But California will not be the only state making lower-cost insulin available. The nonprofit Civica said it will also distribute its economical diabetes medication to pharmacies nationwide. California began partnering with Civica in 2023 for its California prescription CalRx brand of insulin and put $50 million toward its development, the company said. Weber, October 16, 2025. Spending and fiscal battles. Politico, it is too late to extend ACA subsidies without major disruptions. Some states and lawmakers say time is quickly running out to shield Obamacare customers from explosive sticker shock. State insurance officials are warning that the longer Congress waits to extend enhanced Affordable Care Act subsidies, which help low and middle income people afford premiums, the more difficult it will be to update rates before consumers start shopping for 2026 coverage. On November 1, 2025, King and Hooper, October 16, 2025. Politico, Republicans again find themselves in an Obamacare pickle. The ongoing debate over soon to expire Affordable Care Act insurance subsidies has reopened an old wound for Republicans. What should they do about the healthcare law they have railed against for more than a decade, but has now taken root with their own constituents? While some GOP hardliners are again embracing repeal and replace rhetoric, the scars from the failed attempt of Republicans to undo the ACA in 2017 have left a broader swath of Republicans extremely wary of trying to rip out the law, even as they continue to criticize it. Guggenheim, Carney and Hill, October 17, 2025. Associated Press, AP. Democrats say Trump should be involved in shutdown talks. President Donald Trump is showing little urgency to broker a compromise that would end the government shutdown, even as Democrats insist no breakthrough is possible without his direct involvement. 3 weeks in Congress is at a standstill. The House has not been in session for a month, and senators left Washington on Thursday, frustrated by the lack of progress. Republican leaders are refusing to negotiate until a short-term funding bill to reopen the government is passed, while Democrats say they will not agree without guarantees on extending health insurance subsidies. For now, Trump appears content to stay on the sidelines. Capelletti and Min Kim, October 17, 2025. In related news about Medicaid cuts, the American Essential Hospitals president and CEO had no time to ease into her new role. In September, the association and its nearly 400 members, a mix of urban safety net hospitals and rural community hospitals, are facing steep federal funding cuts starting next year, plus ongoing economic pressures. And right now, a 2-week government shutdown. Hudson, October 16, 2025. KFF Health News. States Jostle Over $50 billion rural health fund as the Trump Medicaid cuts trigger scramble. Nationwide, states are racing to win their share of a new $50 billion rural health fund, but helping rural hospitals, as originally envisioned, is quickly becoming a quaint idea. Rather, states should submit applications that rebuild and reshape how healthcare is delivered in rural community centers for Medicare and Medicaid services, official Abe Sutton said late last month during a day-long meeting at the Washington, D.C. Watergate Hotel. Simply changing the way government pays hospitals has been tried and has failed, Sutton told the audience of more than 40 office staffers in the office of the governor and state health agency leaders, some from as far away as Hawaii. Tribble, October 17, 2025. What the AMA says about the Trump policies. Stat AMA president defends the doctor group response to Trump policies. The American Medical Association president defended the restrained advocacy strategy that the largest professional medical organization in America has taken with Trump, while playing up the alignment between federal health officials and the AMA on issues like prior authorization. As part of a Thursday conversation at the Stats Summit, Gaffney, October 16, 2025. National Institutes of Health NIH workers detail grim reality of crippled agency in constant chaos. The former leaders and a researcher tracking the effects of funding cuts lament the loss of research critical to their mission and fear up and coming scientists will not seek government work. They also fear things have not bottomed out yet. Plus, the morbidity and mortality weekly report is on hiatus despite being published during previous shutdowns. NBC News. The fates of fired CDC workers hang in the balance after a week of chaos. After a week of chaos and confusion, as Centers for Disease Control and Prevention employees described it, the fates of more than 600 workers hang in the balance now that a federal judge has temporarily blocked their terminations. Bendix and Edwards, October 16, 2025. MedPage Today. Voice of CDC goes silent. The morbidity and mortality weekly report. NWR is not publishing during the federal government shutdown, a departure from the past. According to sources, the CDC flagship scientific publication was published during every previous shutdown back into the 1990s. At least Charlotte Kent, PhD, MPH, the most recent former editor of the journal, told MedPage Today. Fiore, October 16, 2025. More on RFK Jr. The Hill. John Thune questions RFK Jr. medical advice for women. Senate Majority Leader John Thune Republican of South Dakota said if he was a woman, he would not take medical advice from Health and Human Services Secretary RFK Jr. citing recent claims the secretary made that President Trump endorsed John Thune in a Thursday interview, was asked whether the GOP was becoming a party of no dissent, noting that lawmakers like Republican Senators Bill Cassidy, Republican of Louisiana, and Susan Collins, Republican of Maine, who are up for re-election, are among the few who have publicly disagreed with party leadership in the White House on some issues. Choi, October 16, 2025. Stat: Nephew Joe Kennedy 3 split with Uncle RFK Jr. over grave concerns about U.S. health on vaccines and funding cuts. The Colorado Sun. Colorado joins new multi-state alliance for public health guidance in the latest attempt to push back on changing federal health policy under Trump. Colorado has joined with 13 other states and one territory to form a new group called the Governor's Public Health Alliance. Ingold, October 17, 2025. Health industry with possible sale of 2 Pennsylvania hospitals. The troubled tale of the Prospect Company may soon end. Deals are in the works to sell 2 of its shuttered hospitals, Chester Medical Center and Springfield Hospital, for a combined $13 million. In other news from Pennsylvania, Philadelphia-based Jefferson Health is laying off 650 workers. Chicago Tribune, Weiss West Suburban owe more than $69 million in taxes. The now shuttered Weiss Memorial Hospital and its sister hospital West Suburban Medical Center owe more than $69 million in unpaid taxes and penalties to the state of Illinois, according to documents and information from the Illinois Department of Healthcare and Family Services. Schenker, October 16, 2025. Private equity investors are training their attention on cardiology. A fast-growing specialty rife with financial opportunity. Investor interest in outpatient cardiology practices has grown in recent years, driven by a fragmented market landscape facing financial pressures and an aging population of patients and providers. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services also is reimbursing more cardiac procedures in ambulatory settings, which has been an impetus for private equity firms to make investments. Hudson, October 16, 2025. On layoffs and staff shortages in tech news. Modern healthcare. The Microsoft Dragon Copilot adds ambient AI tool for nurses. Microsoft is expanding the capabilities of its generative artificial intelligence assistant Dragon Copilot by adding a specialized tool for nurses. The tool will allow nurses to document care using ambient AI, a technology that captures audio conversations between patients and clinicians and enters summaries of those interactions into the electronic health record, the company said Thursday. Perna, October 16, 2025. Headlines: The New York Times, October 19, 2025. Artificial intelligence opinion. What is the OpenAI Sora Slop app for exactly? The New York Times. Artificial intelligence. Trump posts fake AI video of himself flying a King Trump jet over protesters. The New York Times. California. Nature. A sea otter is stealing surfboards near Santa Cruz, California. The New York Times. California. Trump military shell detonated over interstate 5 during Marines event. California officials say. The New York Times. California. Trump military advance flexes the might of Marines as thousands protest the Trump agenda. The New York Times. Consumers exercise 9 exercises for strong, stable ankles. The New York Times. Consumers housing, moving, and retirement. Here is how to minimize regrets. The New York Times. Democrats. It is 2025 and Democrats are still running against Trump. The New York Times. Democrats. White House and government agencies join Blue Sky, then attack Democrats. The New York Times. Gun control. Consumers information. Wikipedia. Volunteers avert tragedy by taking down gunmen at conference. The New York Times. Music. Netflix jumps into podcasts with Spotify deal. The New York Times. Nature. Sea otters are stealing surfboards in Santa Cruz again. The New York Times. New York City mayoral race opinion. Mamdani Jeffries and how to beat Trump at his own game. The New York Times. New York City mayoral race opinion. When I look at Zoran Mamdani, here is what I see. The New York Times. No Kings protest against Trump draws thousands across the U.S. The New York Times. No Kings scenes from the No Kings anti-Trump protests in video and photos. The New York Times. Republicans opinion. The right has gone woke. The New York Times. Republicans shutdown fight reopens debate in GOP over healthcare. The New York Times. RFK Jr. lack of knowledge of medicine and science opinion. Circumcision is controversial. Of course, Kennedy links it to autism. The New York Times. Rural voters opinion. The HBO miniseries Task gets rural America right. The New York Times. TV. The Bari Weiss first days at CBS booking big guests and irked by leaks. The New York Times. TV. NBC News cuts about 7% of staff. The New York Times. Tennessee University. Can a university from Tennessee help accelerate growth in West Palm Beach? The New York Times. Trump actions opinion. Trump is dragging us down to his level. The New York Times. Trump economy. Gold bars, gold necklaces, gold earrings. The rush to cash in the New York Times. Trump economy. Wealthy Americans are spending, people with less are struggling. The New York Times. Trump economy. Wirecutter guide to navigating tariffs this holiday season. Reviews by Wirecutter. Trump enemy case against Bolton raises questions over the Justice Department use of Espionage Act. The New York Times. Trump Epstein fallout opinion. The burden placed on sexual abuse survivors. The New York Times. Trump technology. The tech right gets its own Phyllis Schlafly. The New York Times. Women's sports. The WNBA has become extremely popular. Ticket prices are now rising. The New York Times. Columbia. Trump live updates latest on Columbia protests and government shutdown news. The New York Times. France Louvre closed after brazen daylight robbery. The New York Times. France Louvre robbers take priceless French jewels. The New York Times. France Louvre robbery. What was stolen? The New York Times. China opinion. The Trump crackdown on Chinese students ignores a startling new reality. The New York Times. Japan. Sanai Takaichi is set to be the Japan first female prime minister, but will she advance rights of women? The New York Times. Headlines. The New York Times. October 18, 2025. Aviation. Delta and United are leaving other airlines behind. The New York Times. California military plans to fire artillery over California freeway on Saturday. The New York Times. California. San Francisco venture capitalist Ron Conway resigns from board over Benioff National Guard comments. The New York Times. Consumers exercise. Can this tape really improve your workout? The New York Times. Consumers games police break up Lego theft ring, recovering hundreds of beheaded figurines. The New York Times. Consumers information. Jimmy Wales thinks the world should be more like Wikipedia. The New York Times. Consumers new screws. Torque screws, the best screws you have never used. Reviews by Wirecutter. Consumers sports living next to a college football stadium Complicated at Cal, profitable at Michigan. The Athletic Democrats. The Democratic age wars begin. The New York Times Democrats. The ethicist. My liberal friend will not protest. Do I drop her? The New York Times Democrats. Internet, White House, and government agencies join Blue Sky. Then attack Democrats. The New York Times Generations. Why Gen Z has a hard time building credit. The New York Times government shutdown. The shutdown is stretching on Trump. Does not seem to mind. The New York Times. Illinois. The Obama obelisk rises on the Chicago South Side. The New York Times Medicine. And Science. Why men should not ignore their pelvic floors. The New York Times Medicine and Science. When a hearing aid is not enough. The New York Times Music. How to watch the International Chopin Piano Competition. The New York Times Music. Taylor Swift is our biggest cinematic universe, but the magic is fading. The New York Times. New York City mayoral race. One sign of the Mamdani surge. The impersonators are out in droves. The New York Times. No Kings. Demonstrators begin gathering across the country for protests against Trump. The New York Times. No Kings. How the New York Times covers crowds from protests to campaign events. The New York Times. No Kings protest against Trump draws thousands across the U.S. The New York Times. No Kings opinion. The No Kings protests prove the Trump vulnerability. The New York Times. Republicans after racist texts. New York GOP disbands young Republican group. The New York Times. Republicans dispatches mailbag protests. Neo-Nazis. The long Republican con and more. RFK Jr. lack of science and medicine opinion in search of better ways to understand autism. The New York Times. Tennessee officials sue over National Guard presence in Memphis. The New York Times. Trump actions. Education Department agrees to resume more student loan cancellations. The New York Times. Trump actions. Food stamp benefits may run out in November. Officials warn. The New York Times. Trump actions. George Santos is released from prison. His lawyer says after Trump commutes his sentence. The New York Times. Trump actions. Santos in his own words pleading for mercy and promising a comeback. The New York Times. Trump actions. The Santos release frustrates his former colleagues and constituents. The New York Times. Trump actions. Opinion. How Southern politics shape Trumpism. The New York Times. Trump actions. Trump unveils plans for triumphal arch in D.C. to celebrate the 250th anniversary of America. The New York Times. Trump economy. Coast Guard buys 2 private jets for NOAM, costing $172 million. The New York Times. Trump economy. The risk that built America. The New York Times. Trump education agenda. The White House aggressive tactics are complicating its education agenda. The New York Times. Trump enemies prosecutor who rejected the Trump pressure to charge Letitia James is fired. The New York Times. Trump Epstein fallout. United Kingdom for Prince Andrew. A steady fall from grace ends in a hard landing. The New York Times. Trump Epstein fallout. The Jeffrey Epstein angry emails to billionaire Leon Black. The New York Times. Trump Epstein fallout. United Kingdom Prince Andrew surrenders Duke of York title amid Epstein fallout. The New York Times. Trump military opinion. Frady cat at the Pentagon. The New York Times. Trump pollution. The kids who sued Trump just lost big in court, or did they? The New York Times. Trump tariffs. Trump sets tariffs on trucks and buses and extends exemptions for automakers. The New York Times. Universities want to know what you will pay for college. There is a fast new calculator for that. The New York Times. Virginia. University of Virginia will not join the White House compact for colleges. The New York Times. Venezuela. U.S. is repatriating survivors of its strike on suspected drug vessel. The New York Times. Venezuela announces sweeping military exercises as U.S. escalates pressure. The New York Times. Ukraine. Trump backs off suggestion to give tomahawks to Ukraine again, deferring to Putin. The New York Times. Ukraine braces for new talks without the leverage of new missiles. The New York Times. Israel relief and grief. What Jewish New Yorkers feel after the hostage release. The New York Times. China. Lithium battery fire aboard Air China flight forces emergency landing. The New York Times. Headlines. The New York Times. October 17th, 2025 afternoon. California. San Francisco. Benioff apologizes for saying Trump should send troops to San Francisco. The New York Times. Crime. Mangione seeks information about the United Health contact with Trump. The New York Times. Democrats government shutdown. Unions return to court as Trump eyes additional cuts during shutdown. The New York Times. Illinois. Trump asks Supreme Court to allow National Guard deployment in Chicago area. The New York Times. Indiana. Trump pushes Indiana lawmakers to redraw state maps. The New York Times. Medicine and Science. How a Long Island woman was diagnosed with chikungunya. The New York Times. Medicine and Science. How to avoid a root canal. The New York Times. Medicine and Science. 3 cases of mpox strain tied to severe illness worry health experts. The New York Times. Medicine and Science. What your hair can tell you about your health. The New York Times. RFK Jr. vaccine denial. COVID vaccines in first trimester not tied to birth defect study finds. The New York Times. Trump economy. For 3 years the bull market defied inflation, tariffs, and gravity. The New York Times. Trump economy. Investors shudder at signs of loan trouble in banks. The New York Times. Trump economy. Opinion. World Liberty Financial is a powerful vehicle for those seeking influence. The New York Times. Trump Epstein fallout. United Kingdom Prince Andrew surrenders Duke of York title amid Epstein fallout. The New York Times. Trump medicine and insurance. Higher Obamacare prices become public in a dozen states. The New York Times. Trump pollution. The government is shut down, but not for fossil fuels. The New York Times. Trump pollution. U.S. pressures countries to delay fees to clean up ship pollution. The New York Times. Trump transportation stymied. NYC halts Midtown bus lane plan following White House threats. The New York Times. Universities. Penn and USC become latest universities to reject White House deal. The New York Times. Venezuela gasoline. Chevron thrives in Venezuela despite threats by Trump. The New York Times. Venezuela. The Machado Nobel Peace Prize brings hope and scrutiny to the Venezuela opposition. The New York Times. Venezuela maps where the U.S. is building up military force in the Caribbean. The New York Times. Venezuela senators move to force vote to bar ground strikes in Venezuela. The New York Times. Venezuela. U.S. detains 2 survivors of latest military strike in Caribbean. The New York Times. Ukraine. Opinion. Russia will not stop until NATO acts. The New York Times. Ukraine. Russia jails street band for performing anti-war songs. The New York Times. Madagascar president was ousted after youth protests. Now what? The New York Times. Ukraine. Trump meets with Zelensky on Ukraine war after Putin phone call. Live updates. The New York Times. Ukraine. Trump to meet with Zelensky on weapons for Ukraine. Live updates. The New York Times. Ukraine. Trump Waivers as Zelensky seeks long-range missiles to fight Russia. Live updates. The New York Times headlines. The New York Times, October 17, 2025. Morning business. Opinion. World. Liberty Financial is a powerful vehicle for those seeking influence. The New York Times, California bans artificial food dyes from schools. What to know. The New York Times, California, San Francisco, the growing blowback against Mark Benioff, CEO of Salesforce. The New York Times, California, San Francisco, Salesforce offers its services to boost the Trump immigration force. The New York Times, consumers exercise the fastest way to boost your fitness. Sprinting. The New York Times, consumers food 5 healthy nutrient-rich whole grains and how to cook them. The New York Times, consumers housing. The hidden costs of downsizing. The New York Times, consumers sleep. When should you see a doctor about sleep? The New York Times, Democrats left wing threaten terrorism charges against Antifa cell show the Trump focus on the left. The New York Times, Democrats, California, San Francisco top San Francisco lawmaker expected to challenge Nancy Pelosi in primary. The New York Times, Democrats, what we know about the latest No Kings protests amid government shutdown. The New York Times, Illinois Democrat disclosure of legal luck. J.B. Pritzker won $1.4 million playing blackjack in Las Vegas. The New York Times, Indiana freedom of the press threatened. Indiana University fires advisor to student newspaper and bars print publication. The New York Times, New York freedom of the press threatened. Trump refiles $15 billion lawsuit against the New York Times. The New York Times, New York City, Seth Meyers, Emma Roberts, and more stars gather for inaugural Tom Wolfe Literary Prizes. The New York Times, New York City mayoral race fact-checking. The New York City mayoral debate. The New York Times, New York City mayoral race. Mayoral candidates spar over Trump qualifications and the Q train. The New York Times, New York City mayoral race opinion. The only candidate with a coherent vision. 3 opinion writers on the mayoral debate. The New York Times, Josh Barrow Mamdani won for the same reason. He is winning the campaign. He is the only candidate with a coherent vision that addresses the New Yorker's concerns about affordability and who actually seems to want to be mayor. New York City mayoral race. 7 takeaways from the first NYC mayoral debate. The New York Times, New York City mayoral race. The top zingers of the mayoral debate. The New York Times, RFK Jr. Trump actions, medicine and science hailing an era of Trump babies. White House unveils IVF proposals. The New York Times, RFK Jr. medicine and health opinion. Trump is defunding medical research. It could cost you your life. The New York Times, Texas astronomy. An army of robot telescopes in Texas makes the stars feel closer than ever. The New York Times, Trump actions, a shutdown where none of the normal rules apply. The New York Times, Trump Epstein fallout book review. The Girl of Nobody by Virginia Roberts Giuffre. The New York Times, Trump actions threat to birth control. Trump decimates birth control office in layoffs. The New York Times, Trump actions, Trump unilateral spending cuts complicate shutdown deal. The New York Times, Trump actions, universities are standing up to Trump. The New York Times, Trump actions, what the Trump war on sanctuary cities is really about. The New York Times, Trump lawsuits, how the Bolton indictment compares to the Trump classified documents case. The New York Times, Trump lawsuits, John Bolton indicted over handling of classified information. The New York Times, Argentina, Trump helped Argentina face an economic meltdown. It came at a cost. The New York Times, Venezuela military commander overseeing escalating attacks off Venezuela coast is stepping down. Officials say. The New York Times, Venezuela's psychological warfare in Venezuela. The New York Times, Venezuela, U.S. military killed Venezuelan fisherman in suspected drug boat attack. Family says. The New York Times, Italy explosion destroys vehicles outside home of Italian journalist. The New York Times, Ukraine for the Zelensky fashion advisorate is all about the suit. The New York Times, Ukraine, Trump to meet with Zelensky on weapons for Ukraine. Live updates. The New York Times, Ukraine, what are Tomahawk missiles and why might Trump give them to Ukraine? The New York Times, Russia opinion, Russia will not stop until NATO acts. The New York Times, Russia, the Putin Trump strategy, lots of flattery and talk of business deals. The New York Times, Israel after horrors, Israeli hostages taste freedom and savor family reunions. The New York Times, Iran, an internet shutdown cuts off Iranians from one another and the world. The New York Times, Somalia, a Somali hospital closed after U.S. aid cuts, fired employees reopened it without pay. The New York Times, you could treat a child for a few dollars now. Those clinics are gone. The New York Times, China, Apple caught between U.S. and China pledges investment in both. The New York Times headlines. The Guardian, October 18, 2025. Artificial intelligence. Are we living in a golden age of stupidity? Artificial intelligence, AI. The Guardian, artificial intelligence, critical thinking is one of the most important aspects of being human according to Stoicism. So why are we handing it over to a machine? Bridget Delaney, The Guardian. Artificial intelligence inside the San Francisco new AI school. Is this the future of U.S. education? Artificial intelligence, AI. The Guardian, artificial intelligence, the platform exposing exactly how much copyrighted art is used by AI tools. Artificial intelligence, AI. The Guardian, California governor says Trump putting ego over responsibility as military show shuts highway. San Diego, The Guardian. Comedians Jimmy Kimmel on the Republicans, so much greed and hypocrisy and duplicity. Late night TV roundup. The Guardian, comedians Jimmy Kimmel, the Trump inner circle knows how dangerous the incessant misinformation from Fox News can be. Late night TV roundup. The Guardian, consumers games. Do flamingos have a favorite leg to stand on? The quiz for kids family. The Guardian, consumers medicine and food beyond chicken soup. What chefs and doctors eat when they are sick or just hungover. Food. The Guardian, crime. U.S. podcaster who helped convict queen of the con disappointed at short sentence. U.S. crime. The Guardian, Democrats, how can blue states fight back against Trump with fiscal disobedience? Eric Reinhardt. The Guardian, Democrats, Trump freezes $11 billion for infrastructure in Democratic states. U.S. federal government shutdown 2025. The Guardian, Democrats, why do so many Gen Z women across the U.S. identify as leftist? U.S. politics. The Guardian, films. Have we done ourselves out of a job? Concerns in film and TV industry over on set. Body scanning AI. The Guardian, films. Paramount Skydance to eliminate 2,000 U.S. jobs. Report. U.S. News. The Guardian, films. Paramount Skydance to eliminate 2,000 U.S. jobs. Report. U.S. News. The Guardian, Florida, an ex of a congressman got a protective order against him. His boss has little to say about it. Arwa Madawi. The Guardian, Mississippi residents sue UK-owned biomass firm granted permit for more emissions. Mississippi, The Guardian music, no one makes money from them, with MTV channels switching off. Is the music video under threat? Music, The Guardian music, Spotify partnering with multinational music companies to develop responsible AI products. Artificial intelligence, AI, The Guardian. Nature, the landscapes of the world may soon be devoid of wild animals, says Nature. Photographer, climate crisis, The Guardian. No Kings, biggest U.S. labor unions fuel No Kings protests against Trump. You need a voice to have freedom. U.S. unions, The Guardian. No Kings, millions expected across all 50 U.S. states to march in No Kings protests against Trump. Protests, U.S. The Guardian. No Kings protest live updates. Millions expected to gather across the U.S. for the protests against Trump. No Kings protest live updates. Bernie Sanders to headline rally in Washington, D.C. No Kings protest live updates. Millions march against Trump in nationwide day of protest. No Kings, Republicans mostly silent as millions of Americans protest Trump on No Kings Day. Protest, U.S. The Guardian. No Kings, U.S. cities to resist the Trump crackdown on dissent with No Kings protests. We will not be bullied. U.S. News, The Guardian. No Kings, what to know about the protests against Trump attracting millions. Trump, The Guardian. Republicans inside the Republican network behind the bid of Big Soda to pit MAGA against Maha Republicans. The Guardian. Republicans use deepfake video of Chuck Schumer in new attack at Chuck Schumer. The Guardian. Trump actions, big tech deploys Orwellian doublespeak to mask its democratic corrosion. Peter Lewis, The Guardian. Trump actions and decency has become a new hallmark. Writer and historian Jelani Cobb on race and Donald Trump. America, Columbia University. The Guardian. Trump actions, Trump claims to be the president of peace, but at home, he is fomenting civil war. Jonathan Friedland, The Guardian. Trump actions, Trump is battling the ravages of time in more ways than one. Dave Schilling, The Guardian. Trump allies Fox News employees expressed concerns network was intentionally aiding Trump. Legal filings reveal Fox News. The Guardian. Trump and Antifa, who are the right-wing influencers filling the Trump head with visions of Antifa. Trump, The Guardian. Trump economy. What is private credit, and should we be worried by the collapse of U.S. firms' economics? The Guardian. Trump Epstein fallout. Epstein trial would have been crapshoot. Plea deal prosecutor tells Congress Jeffrey Epstein. The Guardian. Trump Epstein fallout. United Kingdom Prince Andrew gives up royal titles, including Duke of York, after discussion with King Prince Andrew. The Guardian. Trump enemies. Ex-Trump advisor John Bolton pleads not guilty to sharing classified information. John Bolton, The Guardian. Trump Epstein fallout. United Kingdom shorn of title, status, and dignity. It is the new Prince Andrew. A life he was born to will be replaced by a life he will hate. Stephen Bates. The Guardian. Trump Epstein fallout. 6 great reads. The Virginia Giuffre story, the truth about chat phishing, and the Peter Thiel search for the Antichrist. The Guardian. Trump like economy. 1929 stock market crash, disorder, fright, and confusion, looking back at the devastating Wall Street crash of 1929. Books. The Guardian. Trump nuclear agency, key U.S. nuclear agency to send 80 of workforce home as shutdown drags on U.S. federal government. Shutdown 2025. The Guardian. Trump pollution shipping emissions levy shelved as countries bow to U.S. pressure. Shipping emissions. The Guardian. Trump pollution. U.S. Senate poised to approve industry lobbyist to lead chemical safety at EPA. U.S. Senate. The Guardian. Vermont Republican lawmaker resigns over racist and anti-Semitic group chat. Vermont. The Guardian. Trinidad and Tobago. Trump is killing poor people. Caribbean village mourns victim of U.S. strike. Trinidad and Tobago. The Guardian. Venezuela. Trump claims Maduro willing to give everything to ease U.S. tensions. Venezuela. The Guardian. United Kingdom superdome. Cummings cunningly waits 5 years to reveal national security lapses. John Crace. The Guardian. United Kingdom media. The sale of the Telegraph is no trivial matter in mainstream media, further exploited by the right threatens us all. Jane Martinson. The Guardian. France. Broken promises and political crises. How Emmanuel Macron fell from French favor. Emmanuel Macron. The Guardian. Germany. Far-right. German far-right setting agenda as opponents amplify its ideas. Study finds the far-right. The Guardian. Germany. Nazis. A prophetic 1933 novel has found a surprising second life. It holds lessons for us all. Charlotte Higgins. The Guardian. Italy. Georgia Meloni condemns Italian union leader for Trump courtesan remark. Georgia Meloni. The Guardian. Ukraine. Trump news at a glance. Trump cools on Tomahawk deal for Ukraine and commutes Santos sentence. Trump. The Guardian. Israel. The Trump peace plan is just about holding together, but maybe unraveled by 2 unresolved issues. Rajan Menon. The Guardian headlines. The Guardian. October 17, 2025. Democrats. MAGA is painting the Saturday protests as violent treason. Prove them wrong. Judith Levine. The Guardian. Democrats. The Trump crusade against truth is not just an attack on facts. It is an unraveling of the Enlightenment. Polly Toynbee. The Guardian. Democrats. U.S. nonprofits lock arms amid the Trump menacing of George Soros. We will not be intimidated. U.S. News. The Guardian. Freedom of press threatened. Indiana University orders school paper to seize print edition and fires director of student media. Indiana. The Guardian. Medicine and science. Age against the machine. What I learned after stripping down for a full body skin fashion. The Guardian. Medicine and science. How Chicago succeeded in reducing drug overdose deaths. Chicago. The Guardian. Medicine and science. Overdose in America analysis reveals deaths rising in some regions even as U.S. sees national decline. Opioids crisis. The Guardian. Trump Epstein fallout. The latest Prince Andrew abuse claims are a new low for the royal family brand in this form. It cannot survive. Simon Jenkins. The Guardian. Trump lawsuits against personal enemies. Ex-Trump advisor John Bolton indicted on charges of mishandling classified information. John Bolton. The Guardian. Trump lawsuits against personal enemies. Ex-Trump advisor John Bolton surrenders after indictment. John Bolton. The Guardian. Trump lawsuits against personal enemies. John Bolton at court to surrender to authorities after being indicted. Cat's corner strategy with Tiger and Leone. Saying the quiet part out loud. Roar. Hi, I am Tiger. Our human asked us to get up from our naps and start Cat's Corner strategy with Tiger and Leone. She gave us a list of internet allies which we will post for her here.
Hi, I am Leone. It is better for your mental fitness to go to these websites than to go to bro sites for advice. Substack letters from an American. Heather Cox Richardson. Substack, your local epidemiologist. The Midas Touch. The Guardian. The New York Times.
One introduction. RAWSEP View. The United States government was on track in the Biden administration to reduce the prices for both clean energy heat pumps and clean energy electric cars. Trump tariffs are expected to upset those plans to prevent future air pollution and prevent climate change. The United States government should, instead of certifying wood stoves as safe when they are not safe, go forward with regulations that ban wood stove use and direct government money for use of forest refuse only for home building and furniture building. For just a few examples of use of forest products for non-burning uses, it is well known from scientific and medical research that wood burning is a substantial source of PM 2.5 emissions, yet the wood burning industry uses the scientifically debunked theory named carbon neutrality of wood burning to argue that wood burning replacing coal burning in industry, and in a trickle-down argument that wood burning should continue for home heating should continue. Presumably because it is called renewable, wood may be renewable in the sense that a tree can be planted in the place of a cut-down burned tree, but it takes centuries or decades for the newly planted tree to attain the stature of the cut-down burned tree. During those centuries or decades, photosynthesis, which converts CO2 to oxygen, and so sequesters some carbon, will not take place at the same rate as photosynthesis was performed previously, and wood burning emits both CO2 and PM 2.5, and PM 2.5 is not absorbed by trees, so PM 2.5 is not diminished by planting a tree in the place of a cut-down and burned tree. In fact, a living tree closes its pores against the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning, just as humans hold their breath in the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning. And when a tree closes its pores, the level of photosynthesis that absorbs CO2 pollution goes down. Wood burning emits 90% PM 2.5 particulate matter of 2.5 micrometer size, the perfect size to infiltrate the human lung, setting off a cascade of human health problems and early deaths. Contrary to many beliefs, wood burning emits 2.8 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel coal burning, and wood burning emits 450 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel natural gas burning. Replacing coal burning with wood burning creates more air pollution in the form of CO2 and PM 2.5 than coal burning. This emission data comes from testing the cleanest burning wood stove in the United Kingdom, the Eco-Design Wood Stove and International Convention does not count the emissions from wood burning. The emissions from wood burning are erased from all countries around the world when calculating if each country has met its climate goals. This non-counting or erasure of wood burning emissions data from climate goals does not mean wood burning emissions do not exist. RAWSEP View. Purple air. PM 2.5 monitors hanging from the eaves of the house of a near neighbor should be used to measure the level of PM 2.5 in the air hyperlocally in the yards of near neighbors of indoor residential wood burners. If PM 2.5 levels exceed World Health Organization standards of 5 micrograms per cubic meter annually, then that evidence of air pollution from wood burning should lead to the shutdown of that indoor residential wood burning appliance, one appliance at a time if necessary.